bom dia a todos. É um prazer hoje estar aqui com todos vocês. Algumas pessoas aqui conosco no Meet, outras pessoas assistindo pelo YouTube. Nós tivemos um grande afluxo de pessoas interessadas, estamos muito contentes com isso. São mais de 500 pessoas inscritas para essa sessão da manhã. Esperamos que elas possam estar conosco realmente. Então, esse é um evento que está sendo realizado pela diretoria da Faculdade de Ciências Médicas, junto com a coordenadoria de graduação da Medicina, o Núcleo de Avaliação e Pesquisa em Educação para as Profissões da Saúde e o Núcleo Docente Estruturante da Faculdade de Ciências Médicas. E tem o apoio da Coordenadoria de Apoio Acadêmico, chamada CAAC, do projeto Educadores do Amanhã, que inclui estudantes que fazem uma formação na questão do ensino para a saúde, e o Centro Acadêmico Adolfo Lutz, além da colaboração também da nossa atlética. Então, são objetivos desse evento a discussão de conquistas e avanços na formação médica e aproveitar as experiências nacionais e internacionais para repensarmos como fazer o aprimoramento do nosso currículo, o currículo do curso de Medicina da Unicamp. Eu sou a professora Eliana Amaral e atualmente sou coordenadora desse núcleo de apoio e pesquisa e ensino para as profissões da saúde da FCM. Estou como anfitriã e aqui a apresentadora inicial nessa mesa internacional do evento e quero então dar as boas-vindas a vocês e particularmente aos nossos convidados que aqui já estão conosco, escutando em português, embora eles falem inglês, depois eu vou ajudá-los a entender nossas demandas, nós já conversamos a respeito previamente, e muitas pessoas nos acompanham, então, no canal da FCM no YouTube, pessoas da faculdade e muita gente também de fora da Unicamp, visto que a programação se constitui de dois componentes, um componente que é aberto, isso é, palestras, conferências, mesas que podem ter a participação das pessoas externas através do YouTube, onde poderemos ter perguntas para os nossos convidados, e duas sessões que serão fechadas para a comunidade Unicamp, com o objetivo de fazermos a discussão, então, do nosso aprimoramento diante de todo o debate que teremos aqui nesses momentos. Para mim é um grande prazer, em particular, estar aqui hoje, porque há praticamente um pouco mais de 20 anos atrás, fizemos a grande reforma curricular da medicina na Unicamp, no final dos anos 90, uma grande discussão que houve para essa reforma. Na época, eu estive como participante, membro do nosso departamento, muito próxima desse movimento, vimos os efeitos muito positivos dessa nossa reforma, e agora, mais de 20 anos depois, está na hora da gente repensar de novo, e é esse o nosso objetivo hoje. Então, agradeço muito a presença de todos, a contribuição que todos possam vir a dar, de dentro e de fora da Unicamp, em particular os nossos convidados. Nessa mesa de abertura, nós vamos ter presença, então, certamente, dos nossos diretores, da coordenadora da graduação, e eu começo, então, pedindo que, inicialmente, a professora Joana Frois Bragança Bastos, que é a nossa coordenadora do curso de graduação em Medicina da FCM, que ela faça, então, assim, a sua apresentação inicial e dê as boas-vindas a todos e nos conte um pouquinho por que estamos aqui.
Olá, muito obrigada, professora Eliana. Bom dia a todos, sejam muito bem-vindos. Agradecemos imensamente a presença de todos os convidados internacionais e nacionais, colegas de outras instituições que se juntarão a nós nesses dias de debate, em especial toda a comunidade FCM reunida aqui para o aprimoramento do nosso curso. Eu não posso deixar de falar que a Unicamp é a minha casa desde 1989, quando cheguei aqui com 17 anos, e poucas vezes eu estive mais orgulhosa em fazer parte dessa comunidade que, nesses últimos tempos, superou tantas dificuldades, enfrentando a pandemia na linha de frente e demonstrando o engajamento e compromisso com a qualidade da formação dos nossos alunos. O ensino da nossa escola não parou, nosso internato foi mantido por quase todo o período, conseguimos também manter ensinos de terceiro e quarto ano em 2020 e agora em 2021, mesmo com todas as dificuldades encontradas. E, com orgulho, posso dizer que nesse semestre retomaremos também o primeiro e segundo ano, e desta forma todos os nossos alunos estarão com atividades práticas presenciais, mostrando, enfim, uma formação completa. Os desafios não foram pequenos, mas o engajamento, a criatividade e o compromisso de alunos, funcionários e docentes foi sem precedentes e conseguimos fazer o melhor dentro do possível. Como coordenação, não poderíamos contar com melhores parceiros nesse difícil caminho e sinto a necessidade de agradecer a todos aqui. Esse seminário foi organizado pela diretoria, pela coordenação do curso, pelo NAPES e pelo INDE, e contou com o apoio do Centro Acadêmico, da Atlética e do Educadores do Amanhã, que é a nossa iniciativa de capacitação em ensino médico para os discentes. Esse seminário tem como objetivo trazer para a nossa comunidade o que há de mais relevante e atual no ensino médico no mundo e no Brasil, trazendo palestrantes de excelência em nível mundial e nacional. Nesse encontro, discutiremos o que vem sendo considerado o ensino médico de excelência no mundo, ensino baseado em competências e centrado no estudante, o papel da simulação na formação, novas estratégias educacionais e a reflexão tão pertinente do ensino médico no mundo pós-Covid. Além disso, teremos a oportunidade de discutir com professores brasileiros sobre mudanças curriculares implementadas em outras instituições, os sucessos e os desafios que eles enfrentaram, e ainda discutir o nosso ensino e perfil do egresso e formular propostas em grupos de discussões que serão realizados ao longo do evento. Nosso curso já é considerado de excelência no Brasil e na América Latina, mas temos a capacidade, recursos humanos e materiais para estarmos em nível de excelência das melhores escolas do mundo. Para tal, a mudança se faz imperativa. O ensino médico mudou de forma importante nas últimas décadas, atendendo a novas demandas da nossa profissão. A reforma curricular realizada há mais de 20 anos foi muito importante e precursora de diversas mudanças em outras faculdades do Brasil, reafirmando o papel da Unicamp de liderança em ensino no panorama nacional. Discutir mudanças em nosso curso e no ensino trará certamente aprimoramento do nosso curso, mas também poderá apoiar outras mudanças em outros cursos em nosso país. Estamos passando por um momento peculiar no ensino em todas as áreas, e em especial no ensino de profissionais de saúde. As mudanças impostas pela pandemia agudizaram as deficiências já existentes e desencadearam mudanças e novas demandas que devem ser abordadas e algumas possivelmente incorporadas na nossa formação. Após 2 décadas de reforma, sabemos que é preciso mudar. A mudança curricular é rotineira nas maiores escolas do mundo. Apenas mudando e nos adaptando às novas demandas da profissão, mantemos a excelência no ensino. Nos últimos anos, realizamos mudanças no ensino do ciclo básico do curso, aprimorando a integração básico-clínica. A comunidade engajou-se na identificação de competências necessárias para a formação do médico e estamos trabalhando na comissão de avaliação programática para a reformulação dos nossos sistemas de avaliação. Mas ainda há muito que aprimorar. O projeto pedagógico do nosso curso, seguindo as diretrizes curriculares nacionais, tem como objetivo a formação de médicos generalistas. Para tal, o ensino deverá ser centrado no estudante, isto é, o ensino deverá ter como objetivo as necessidades da formação de acordo com patologias mais prevalentes e competências que esse profissional deve ter. Devemos mudar para o ensino centrado no estudante, deixando para trás um modelo, muitas vezes, centrado no professor e de acordo com as necessidades institucionais. Novas estratégias de ensino emergem e podem e devem ser incorporadas em nosso cotidiano. Novos caminhos para o ensino da semiologia e sua integração com a fisiopatologia devem ser discutidos e propostos. Nossa atuação na rede básica, em especial no ensino da clínica médica nesse campo de prática, poderá alcançar um novo patamar com uma maior integração com a rede e com novos modelos de ensino. Deveremos avaliar o nosso currículo em relação às patologias mais prevalentes e os campos de prática para os quais estamos formando os nossos alunos, a rede básica e urgência e emergência. Essas áreas de conhecimento que tratam de patologias extremamente prevalentes, muitas vezes não estão contempladas em nosso internato, como patologias osteoarticulares, saúde mental, patologias neurológicas prevalentes e ainda a área que é o modelo mais bem-sucedido mundialmente para a estruturação de bons sistemas de saúde, a medicina de família e comunidade, ainda não tem espaço em nosso currículo. Será importante discutir as necessidades de ampliação dos campos de prática, incorporação de novas estratégias e tecnologias de ensino e fazer um balanço das transformações trazidas pela pandemia para avaliar tanto as deficiências deixadas e como superá-las, mas também permanências de novas estratégias incorporadas que trouxeram aprimoramento e poderão ser mantidas. Ressaltamos a importância da participação de toda a comunidade nesse evento, nessa oportunidade de discussão e planejamento dos temas mais relevantes em educação médica da atualidade, com oportunidade de discussão com colegas renomados de instituições, como já disse, internacionais e nacionais. De forma ainda mais importante, devemos identificar e propor nas oficinas mudanças do nosso currículo que darão início a um processo de reforma curricular que deverá ser aprovada até maio de 22 para entrar em vigência em 23. Portanto, organizar a participação de docentes e discentes, em especiais os componentes de comissão de ensino de departamento, trazendo demandas e desafios encontrados na formação de nossos alunos e participação das discussões e elaboração de propostas. Como gestão, acreditamos que esse evento será transformador para a nossa comunidade, sendo o início de um grande aprimoramento do curso de Medicina da FCM Unicamp. Esperamos poder identificar os nossos maiores desafios e trazer propostas de mudanças inovadoras e sustentáveis para o nosso curso e ainda, possivelmente, influenciar novas mudanças no ensino médico no Brasil. Bom evento para todos e que possamos aproveitar essa oportunidade da melhor forma possível. Muito obrigada e estaremos juntos nesses próximos 4 dias.
Muito obrigada, então, professora Joana. Acho que deu uma boa ideia, né, de todo o arcabouço daquilo que nos orienta para esse seminário. E gostaria de pedir agora, então, ao professor Cláudio Coy, que desse suas boas-vindas. O professor Cláudio é o diretor associado da FCM e também coordenador do nosso núcleo docente estruturante.
Bom dia. Eu gostaria de agradecer a presença de todos, agradecer a todos que ajudaram a organizar esse evento. É um evento muito importante que nasceu assim de uma percepção aqui na faculdade de discutir o currículo médico e a forma como esse seminário foi montada, ela vai trazer uma reflexão sobre o nosso currículo, um debate bem maduro e que possa contribuir bastante para as alterações que se fazem necessárias nessa época que estamos passando, numa época em que existem alterações significativas relacionadas à forma de ensinar. Isso vai trazer uma contribuição e, sem dúvida nenhuma, uma qualidade maior de ensino e, obviamente, nossos alunos eles vão estar recebendo uma formação cada vez mais atual e melhor. Eu desejo a todos um grande evento e agradeço mais uma vez a participação de todos, principalmente dos palestrantes, que são professores com uma experiência importante em educação e que seguramente irá contribuir para o nosso debate posterior. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigada, então, professor Coy, sempre dando muito apoio aí às iniciativas dentro da Comissão de Ensino de Graduação, através do Núcleo Docente Estruturante, colocando sempre em debate, levantando as questões que orientaram a necessidade de nós, então, caminharmos para esse seminário. Muito obrigada. Então, agora eu gostaria de chamar o nosso diretor da Faculdade de Ciências Médicas, professor Luiz Carlos Zeferino.
Bom dia a todos. Como diretor da faculdade, juntamente com o professor Coy, é uma honra muito grande estar sediando este evento, por todos os fatores que determinaram a realização desse evento. Cumprimento aqui João Norsini, Brown e Anderson, e cumprimento e agradeço a todos os professores convidados que aceitaram participar deste evento, da nossa instituição e de outras instituições. É um prazer muito grande. Tem Stanley aqui entrando também, Ramstrad. Muito obrigado por ter aceito participar. Bem-vindo também. Primeiro, eu gostaria assim, de dizer que eu tenho muito orgulho do time que está cuidando da graduação na nossa faculdade. A Joana, que já falou, e que coordena a comissão de ensino da graduação, todos os professores, né? Professora Eliana Amaral, que coordena o Núcleo de Avaliação e Pesquisa, Ensino em Saúde, professor Cláudio Coy, coordenador do Núcleo Docente Estruturante. Esse é um time que eu considero muito potente. Atrás desse time tem um grupo de profissionais também muito dedicados, tem dificuldades aqui para citar nomes, mas eu vou me atrever a mencionar aí a Silvia, a Pássaro, o Bruno, a Camila, a Fernandas e outros tantos, né, como aqueles profissionais também da diretoria. Eu acho que o que determina essa revisão do nosso currículo, como já foi mencionado aqui, nós fizemos no segundo semestre de 1998, um seminário, semelhante a esse aqui, também com convidados internacionais, convidados nacionais, professores, e que nós discutimos há mais de 20 anos o nosso currículo, o cenário daquele momento, as nossas necessidades, e naquele momento liderado pela professora Angélica Maria Bicuto, e que acabou resultando, como já foi mencionado aqui, num currículo moderno, novo, e que serviu de referência para várias faculdades. Porém, com 23 anos se passaram desde daquele momento, e aí eu tenho que destacar, que acredito que todos concordam, né, que o ensino em medicina, creio eu, é o ensino que mais se discute no Brasil e mundo afora, pelas sociedades científicas, pelas revistas, pelos pesquisadores desse assunto, e, consequentemente, sempre tem inovações pedagógicas, metodológicas, e a tecnologia atual oferece oportunidades que nós não tínhamos há 23 anos atrás. Haja visto que se cresceu de possibilidades de simulação do curso. Então, todo esse conhecimento assim, adquirido ao longo desse período precisa ser considerado na reconstrução do curso. No Brasil, nós temos um sistema público de saúde que atende 75% da população. 75% da nossa população, de maneira geral, é usuária desse sistema público, e as escolas médicas, os cursos de medicina, precisam estar atentos às necessidades desse sistema público de saúde, que tem na sua atenção primária o modelo de saúde de família, modelo que está presente em todos os países, ou melhor, em quase todos os países, com aqueles com maior índice de desenvolvimento humano. Então, é algo que nós ainda, apesar desse modelo estar há 27 anos definido como tal, as escolas médicas ainda precisam dar uma resposta mais objetiva do ponto de vista da formação de profissionais, atendendo os quesitos e as necessidades do sistema de saúde. A Joana destacou muito bem qual o perfil do médico que a faculdade deve estar atenta na construção do seu currículo. E eu acho que é nesse sentido também nós precisamos aí olhar para o sistema de saúde, também destacado pela professora Joana. Por outro lado, tem 25% da população que é usuária do sistema privado, e também as escolas médicas têm que ter um olhar e perceber as necessidades para atender adequadamente essa demanda. São todos desafios que nós temos que enfrentar. Estou esquecendo de um desafio muito importante, né? Porque hoje, 2021, a Faculdade de Ciências Médicas ela é diferente da faculdade que nós tínhamos em 1998. Não vou ficar aqui destacando as diferenças, mas nós somos diferentes. Então, eu acho que também, como nós somos professores, somos nós que gerenciamos, executamos o curso, somos nós que atuamos, as nossas diferenças também precisam ser consideradas. Enfim, são vários aspectos, são vários pontos que são importantes. Como diretor da faculdade, na medida em que o nosso currículo ele estava se distanciando desses fatos novos, a gestão do currículo de ensino vem se tornando progressivamente um pouco mais, vou falar, difícil, mas com um pouco mais de demandas a serem consideradas, analisadas, né, correndo o risco de promover uma reforma, não reforma, ajustes em retalhos, né, em pedaços, né, do currículo, que seria muito ruim. Então, muito mais lógico, muito mais oportuno fazer uma análise mais inteira, mais integrada do nosso currículo e discutirmos da melhor forma possível para obtermos o melhor resultado, com o objetivo, obviamente, né, de formarmos excelentes profissionais, que esse objetivo nós não podemos abrir mão deles. Então, nesse sentido, mais uma vez, agradeço a todos aqueles envolvidos e desejo a todos os participantes bom evento e agradeço a contribuição. Quero destacar para o final aqui, que eu não mencionei, tá, a importante participação de várias entidades estudantis, né, que desde sempre vem destacando e vem levantando as nossas dificuldades, nossos problemas. São entidades que são sentinelas das nossas dificuldades, tá, e que se dispuserem, estão participando de maneira ativa neste evento, e agradeço a todos os alunos que compõem essas entidades, tá, também pela sua presença e participação. Enfim, bom evento a todos e bom dia, boa semana. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigada, professor Zeferino. Então, acho que nós estamos a 2 minutos do horário previsto de início da nossa próxima sessão, que vai ser a mesa. Eu queria agradecer, então, a colaboração aí de vocês em esclarecer um pouco o contexto para esse evento, que acho que isso é essencial, mas queria terminar, então, esse momento agradecendo particularmente toda a colaboração. Um minutinho só, Joana. Joana que está projetando. Agradecendo toda a colaboração da equipe de apoio, esse evento, pelo número de pessoas que está envolvido, em termos de convidados e em termos de participantes, é um evento que exige, né, uma coordenação muito boa, técnica, para que ele aconteça, e eu espero que ele aconteça com o mínimo de sobressaltos, mas estamos na era da internet, onde a internet cai, a internet some, e então qualquer dificuldade, vocês entrem em contato conosco e vice-versa, ao contrário, se nós tivermos algum problema, nós já nos desculpamos antecipadamente. Bom, para mim, então, é um grande prazer agora passar para a primeira mesa, e nessa primeira mesa eu passo agora a falar em inglês, porque ela será traduzida, ok? Então, muito obrigada a todos que estiveram na mesa de abertura. Well, so let's start with our international conferences, mini-conferences and discussions on where do we go with the medical curriculum. And we will have very important people, VIP people, talking to us about the trends, what's going on in the literature, in the international world, to give us the best directions to think about what we should do from the curriculum we have today. As said before, very successful, an example for other schools as well in Brazil. But now it's time to change, it's time to move, because the world is moving, pandemic is here, and things are really different. So to start, our first presenter will be Professor John Orsini, who is the Emeritus President of the FAMER program in Philadelphia. I have been a fellow at the FAMER program, and we had the experience of bringing what we call the FAMER Junior to Unicamp, and the name that we use here for this, the students who have been developed in medical education, is Educators for Tomorrow. So it's a great pleasure for all of us to have in Orsini someone that they know a lot from their studies as well. So Orsini, the room is yours, or the screen is yours. And he's going to talk about what is quality in curriculum, in medical curriculum today. And Joanna is sharing the slides, so it's your time now. Thank you very, very much.
Bom dia. Thank you for having me here today. I'm really looking forward to hearing the conversation. As Eliana mentioned, I will be talking about ensuring the quality of medical education. That's what she asked me to speak about. Could I have the next slide? So what I thought I would do are three things. First of all, talk a little about what's happening in Brazil today. Eliana was kind enough to share some information to educate me, so I'm up to date on what the current trends are in the country. I'll then talk a little bit about what makes a good medical school. And I'll speak specifically about the 2020 edition of the World Federation for Medical Education standards, which I think is a reasonable place to start if you want to know what a good medical school is. Then I'll talk at the end about how we can be sure the outcomes of that education are good. So I'll talk about external examinations and specifically the relationship with patient outcomes. So that's the plan for the next few minutes. What this slide shows, and Eliana provided it, is the number of graduates of Brazilian medical schools from 2001. And what you can see in looking at this is that there's been an incredible increase. The numbers doubled from 2001 through 2013. And if you look at 2020, they're more than 3 times the numbers of 2001. So the bottom line here is that the medical education programs and medical schools in Brazil have increased dramatically, as have the number of graduates. Can I have the next slide, please? One of the things to think about and one of the statistics that the World Health Organization keeps is the ratio between the number of graduates of medical schools and the population. So in Brazil now, there are about 10.4 graduates for each 100,000 residents, inhabitants. And that's a great number. That's certainly more than many of the other countries around the world. As you can see from this slide, that's greater than Chile, France, the US, Japan, South Korea, and a variety of other countries. So this is really a wonderful increase, one that I'm sure serves the inhabitants of Brazil, the Brazilian citizens well. However, just like everywhere else around the world, unfortunately, these physicians are not distributed exactly as you'd like them to be. So if you look at Vitoria, there's about 13 or 14 physicians per population. If you look at cities with fewer than 5,000 inhabitants, it's 0.37. So there's a maldistribution of physicians, and this again is an issue around the world. I think there's just about every country a maldistribution between the cities and the rural settings. So the bottom line here is that the numbers have increased dramatically over the past 20 years. And one of the things that's important to do as these numbers increase is to keep track of the quality of medical education through this time. Could I have the next slide, please? So one of the ways to do that is to think about what actually makes a good medical school. That's a really hard question, and there are many, many answers to it. But one group that I think has come up with a very reasonable set of standards for thinking about what makes a medical school is the World Federation for Medical Education. This is a group that's in relationship with the World Health Organization and is internationally representative. And what they did in 2003 was to develop the first version of standards for basic medical education. These are not a core curriculum. They're not intended to define the content of education. but I think they're actually useful in making judgments about the quality of a medical school. Next slide, please. So the WFME, when they created this, intended the standards to be used as a basis for curriculum development. They didn't expect them to be taken as a whole. They expected that they would be modified in accordance with local needs. The WFME thought this would be a great way to plan for quality improvement, as well as a system of evaluation to ensure minimum quality for schools. Next slide, please. So the standards were created by an international panel of physicians. Basically, what they did is they reviewed standards used around the world, took from that what they thought were the best of the group, and put it together in the 2003 standards. Since then, they revised them. They revised them in 2012, 2015, and most recently last year. And the WFME estimates that at least half the medical schools in the world have used these standards. So they're valuable, I believe, given the level of use that medical schools have made of them. Next slide, please. So the revision in 2020, which I had an opportunity to work on, had a number of goals. Basically, the first goal was to reflect current trends in medical education. So the first reason to redo the standards was that medical education, as Eliana just said, has been changing, and as a consequence, the standards needed to be revised. There was also a desire to shift the focus from telling folks what to do to laying out a set of principles. So the newer standards reduce the level of specificity, and they're called principle-based standards, and I'll show you an example of that in just a little bit. Third goal was to streamline the standards. They had run to several pages, 10, 15, 20 pages of standards, which are a lot for a school to deal with. So the idea was to reduce them to some degree. And finally, when doing that, we wanted to make sure that they were compatible with previous versions of the standards. So we didn't want schools to have to go back and redo everything. We wanted the standards that we developed to be compatible with those standards in 2015. Next slide, please. So the process for this was that we drafted a set of standards. The standards were shown to the executive committee of the World Federation for Medical Education and to the president. They took those standards, they offered revisions to them. Then after those revisions were incorporated, they took the standards and promulgated them at a number of national and international meetings. And they were drafted again. And finally, input was invited from experts around the world, from the regional medical associations, from recognized accrediting bodies around the world. And at the end of the day, more than 60 institutions and/or experts offered comments on the standards. That was an internationally representative group. They were from around the world, and they were the leaders in education and education and accreditation around the world. Could I have the next slide, please? We got more than 1,000 comments. They were favorable to the approach, but they offered detailed comments on each of the standards. We incorporated those into the final version, showed them to the president of the WFME and the WFME Executive Committee. They made whatever changes they wanted, and the standards were finally published last year. Next slide, please. So the framework for the standards actually didn't change very much from 2015 to 2020. As you can see, the 2020 standards have sections devoted to mission and values, curriculum, assessment, students, academic staff, educational resources, quality assurance, and governance and administration. And the ones in red are the ones that changed from 2015. And as you can see, all the changes are incredibly minor. But the important thing about this is it covers all aspects of the medical school and incorporates all of them in the standards. So this is a comprehensive framework for judging medical schools. Next slide, please. So one of the major changes from 2015 to 2020 is that we changed to something called principles-based standards. So one of the reasons for this is that if you want to judge the quality of a medical school, the context in which they exist, the country, their mission, all of those things make a huge difference in terms of how you judge the quality of the medical school. So medical education tends to follow socially constructed values and ideas. Those values and ideas vary across cultures and they vary across geography. So the idea was to create standards that allowed institutions to make modifications that were appropriate to their context. The idea was not to prescribe what needed to be done, but to offer direction so that the standards that were applied were actually appropriate to the context. Next slide, please. So what are these? These are standards that are a very broad level of generality. For example, they ask for a mission or a curriculum, but they don't tell you what that needs to be. And the other side of that is, although they're very general, the medical school needs to make justifications for the choices they make in the context, in their local context. So I think they come closer to meeting global needs. And in particular, I think they're useful for pushing along towards the Millennium Development Goals. Next slide, please. Since they're so broad, I think we thought that users needed a little more help than we traditionally provided with the standards. So each of the standards is accompanied by guidance, which offers the school a way of thinking through justifying whatever decisions they've made. And each standard is also accompanied by a set of key questions that the school can ask themselves that identify important things for them to think about as they reach decisions on each of the standards. Next slide, please. So to give you an example of how things have changed, in 2015, as I mentioned, one of the areas in the framework was mission and outcomes. And there were 8 standards under mission and outcomes in 2015. So the first is that the school needed to state its mission. It needed to make that mission known to its constituency in the health sector. Its mission needed to outline the aims and educational strategies it was using to result in a competent doctor. That doctor had to have an appropriate foundation for future career in any branch of medicine. Next slide, please. That doctor needed to be capable of undertaking the roles of a doctor as defined by the healthcare system. The doctor needed to be prepared and ready for postgraduate medical education. The doctor needed to be committed to lifelong learning. And the doctor needed to consider that the mission encompasses the health needs of the community, the needs of the healthcare delivery system, and other aspects of social accountability. So as you can see in 2015, there were a set of very detailed ways of beginning to think about what the mission of a medical school is. And it's not that these were necessarily bad, but they're not appropriate for each and every medical school. So could I have the next slide, please? So in the new edition, there's only one standard. That standard is that the school needs to have a public statement that sets out its values, priorities, and goals. Next slide, please. However, as I mentioned, we also associated with that both guidance and key questions. So the guidance to the school as it decides on a mission are that it needs to consider the role, the audiences and uses of the mission, need to describe the school's purpose, values, research functions, educational goals, relationship with the healthcare services and communities, indicate the extent to which the statement has been developed in consultation with stakeholders, and describe how the mission statement guides the curriculum and quality assurance. So you can see that the standard is very brief and very general, but the guidance is very specific and should help the school as it identifies what's important in its setting. Next slide, please. And finally, there are a set of key questions that the school can ask itself as it comes to some decisions about this. So how is the mission statement specifically tailored to the school? Which interest groups were involved? How does the medical school mission address its role in the community? How is it used for planning, quality assurance, and management? How does it fit with the regulatory standards of the accrediting agency? And how is it publicized? So as you can see, all the things that were in the standards, in the very prescriptive standards that were in 2015 have now been changed to make them more general, to put the onus in a way on the medical school to think through all these things, but to develop its own set of standards that's relative to the local context. Next slide, please. So these standards, I think, offer a vision of what constitutes a good medical school, and they can be used as a basis for evaluation. So if you wanted, for example, to do a self-study, this would be a wonderful set of standards that you could use as a basis for that, as well for quality improvement. It establishes a basis for assessing change. And in particular, I think, more even than the standards, the guidance and key questions can be very useful. They can help you develop thinking, your own thinking about what it is that matters in your own context. Next slide, please. But I'm not sure that evaluating the school itself is enough. And I think that because even the best schools are going to graduate some students who are less than competent. Schools, as you know, have a conflict of interest. They are engaged both in the teaching of students as well as their assessment. And as a consequence of that, I think there's some conflict of interest around graduating students and their competence. In addition, graduates may move around the country throughout their careers. So what happens in one medical school may not translate if there aren't some sort of national or external assessments, might not translate well to another part of the country. And in addition to that, the number and nature of schools is changing. There's been a big shift over the past 20 years in Brazil and in a number of other countries around the world where medical education used to be mostly public. Now it's mostly private. So all of those things, I think come together to suggest that evaluating the school itself isn't enough. It's important to look at the competencies of the graduates as well. Go to the next slide, please. So the idea of doing some sort of external assessment of students at or near their graduation will assure that all the individual physicians are competent. So it assures that they all reach the same standard. It allows the schools to be diverse and to support local missions, but at the same time ensuring that a mobile workforce, both within and across countries, will be competent at a minimum level. Now, the key about these international assessments or these external assessments is that there's lots of evidence that they're associated with educational markers of competence, but a lot less evidence that they're associated with actual patient outcomes. And so what I want to talk about is some work that I've been involved with throughout my career, looking at the relationship between these external national assessments and patient outcomes. Next slide, please. So I've had the privilege of working with two organizations in my career. The first is the Educational Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates, or ECFMG. ECFMG certification is required for graduates of non-US medical schools who want to take postgraduate training in the US. In the US, we are, I think, blessed to have a substantial number of international medical graduates in the healthcare workforce. 20 to 25% of the physicians in postgraduate training are international medical graduates. Likewise, 20 to 25% of the practicing doctors in the US are graduates of international medical schools. So looking at the examinations that have been part of that are really critical. If you compare the international medical graduates to US medical graduates, what you find is that the international medical graduates are naturally much more heterogeneous, much more variable group than the US graduates. In addition, in the US, we have a process of specialty certification in the specialties of medicine. The specialty board sets standards for training and exam performance. Participation in these, oddly enough, is voluntary. You don't need to be certified in the US to perform surgery or to engage in any of the specialties. But most physicians do attempt certification, and 80 to 90% of physicians are board certified. Next slide, please. So in the studies I'm going to talk about, we had three sort of sources of data. We had the AMA master file, which contains basic information on all physicians in the US and whether or not they have certification in their specialty. From the Educational Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates, we have information about physicians who are international medical graduates and those schools. And from the American Board of Internal Medicine, when I worked there, we had information on physicians who sought certification in internal medicine and cardiology. Next slide, please. In terms of patient data, we had data from an institution called the Pennsylvania Healthcare Cost Containment Council. Basically, this is a government agency in the state of Pennsylvania, and it collects information on all hospitalizations in the state. It's administrative data, basically, and it collects that data to create report cards for doctors and hospitals. And it also shares that data, or those data, with research entities, and that's how we had access to it. Next slide, please. To give you some sense of what Pennsylvania is like, it is the 6th most populous state in the US, similar in population size to Parana in Brazil. It is 33rd largest in size, geographical size, about the size of Umapa. And it's an odd state in that much of it is rural. Of the 67 counties within the state, 48 are rural, and about a quarter of the population live in those rural counties. And there are a substantial number of IMGs. Next slide, please. So I won't talk to you a lot about the statistical details of this. The one thing I want to be clear about is that when we did our analysis, we statistically removed the effects of a large number of variables before looking at the effects on patient outcomes. So we removed a series of variables around patients, around individual doctors, and around the hospitals in which those doctors treated the patients. And if anybody's interested, I'm happy to talk to you about more about the statistics later. Next slide, please. So I'll take you in a little bit of detail for this first study, and then the other ones I'll just very briefly introduce. So in this study, we were wondering whether there were differences between international medical graduates and US medical graduates. If ECFMG certification is working the way it should, then the two groups should be the same in terms of their patient outcomes. So for this particular study, we had about 6,000 doctors, all the doctors in the state who identified themselves as family doctors, general internists, or cardiologists. We knew some things about the doctors. We knew who had specialty certification. We knew who was a cardiologist. We knew how long they'd been in practice. We knew how many patients they treated throughout the course of the study. And we knew who were US medical graduates and who were international medical graduates. And further, we could break the international medical graduates down into two groups: those who were US citizens who'd gone abroad for training, and those who were non-US citizens. We had all 184 hospitals in the state. We knew which were located in rural counties, and we also knew their patient volume. For the patients, we had some sense of how sick they were. We had an estimate of their probability of death on admission to hospital. So in a sense, we had some sense of the number of comorbidities they had. and how those influence the outcomes. And we looked at, as an outcome measure, in-hospital mortality. And what we found is that there were no differences between international medical graduates and US medical graduates. However, when we broke the international medical graduates into two groups, we looked separately at the non-US citizens and the US citizens who'd gone abroad. We did find differences. In fact, the patients of the non-US citizen international medical graduates had a reduction in relative risk of 9% if their doctor was an international citizen who graduated from an international medical school compared to US medical graduates, and a 15% reduction in relative risk against the patients of doctors who were US citizens who'd gone abroad for their training. So the bottom line here is that if you look at ECFMG certification, there's no difference in patient outcomes between US graduates and international medical graduates. Next slide, please. One of the questions we asked was whether higher scores were associated with better patient outcomes for international medical graduates. As you can see, all the details are on this slide. The bottom line here is that each addition of a standard deviation in score was associated with a 4% reduction in mortality, in relative risk for mortality among patients. So the bottom line is that if you look at a doctor who just passed the examination, and you look at that doctor's patients and compare them to the patients of the doctors who scored the very best, 2 standard deviations above the mean, found that the doctors who scored the best on the examination, their patients had a 16% reduction in relative risk for mortality following congestive heart failure and acute myocardial infarction. Next slide, please. In this set of studies, we looked at whether there were differences in outcomes between certified and uncertified physicians in internal medicine, family medicine, and cardiology. Basically, in this study, we found that certification if a doctor was board certified, there was a relative risk reduction of 15%, absolute reduction of 1.5 or 2% in hospital mortality following acute myocardial infarction. Next slide, please. And finally, we wondered whether they were based on examination performance. So we looked at internists and cardiologists who had satisfactorily completed training versus those who were board certified. So the only difference being whether or not they had passed the examination. And what we found is that the patients of board certified doctors had a relative risk reduction of 19%, absolute reduction of 1.5 to 2% following acute myocardial infarction. Next slide, please. So the bottom line here is that external assessments will ensure that individual physicians are competent, that they'll reach the same standard of minimal competence, that they'll allow a diversity of medical schools, that they'll support a mobile workforce. And the most important part of this is that they work, that there's an association between performance on these kind of examinations and the quality of healthcare. Next slide, please. So to summarize, ensuring the quality of medical education, I think, has 2 parts. First part is evaluating the quality of the medical school itself. I think the 2020 edition of the WFME standards for basic medical education are a very useful way to approach that issue. They provide guidance in thinking about what a good medical school is in your own context. I also think it's important to have an external assessment of graduates. We know that external examinations are associated with patient outcomes, and as a consequence, they're effective in producing good results. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. I think your presentation will bring a lot of questions and may have brought a lot of thoughts for people. So it's food for thought, for sure. And we have the discussion later after the 2 next presenters. So we'll be very happy if you can stay with us and participate in the final discussion as well. Thank you. So now I'm calling for Brownie Anderson, who is a friend of Brazil, almost speaking Portuguese. I'm always teasing her. And Brownie will talk about the competence-based education and student-centered based education in medical school. So Brownie, thank you very much to be with us. Brownie has recently changed her situation and position and is always very happy to and available for us to help Brazilians and the medical school at Unicamp. Thank you very much, Brownie.
Bom dia. I am learning Portuguese. I'm studying it every day, and it is a very difficult language. So I won't be speaking it, but I do understand a little bit. It's an honor to be connected again with Unicamp because I had the privilege of visiting there a few years ago. And also because of the work that you and others in Brazil are doing with competency-based education. Next slide, please. So in the time we have this morning, I would like to talk about the kinds of health professionals that we want from the curricula that we're creating, to look at some of the lessons that we have learned and challenges that we have found with competency-based education and assessment, and then to leave you with some questions to consider and some possible changes that we need to be thinking about in the future. Next slide, please. Now, in the US, and I know to some degree in Brazil, we have a very fragmented healthcare system. And we need to have people, we need to be able to assure that our graduates and our practitioners are competent and able to work together in this challenging system. Next slide, please. This is a diagram that's a little bit hard to see, but it depicts what the American Medical Association and medical schools around the US have identified as an ideal 21st century healthcare education. And in addition to lifelong learning and competency-based assessment, it includes critical components such as patient outcomes, team-based care, wellness, and prevention, the healthcare workforce. So as you are thinking about your curriculum, these are all components that I encourage you to consider as you're thinking about the future. Next slide, please. I think that it doesn't matter what country you're in, we have shared outcomes that we want from health professions education now. We want practitioners who have a humanistic approach to medicine and a patient-centered approach to medical care. I think that one of the lessons that we are learning from the worldwide pandemic is the notion of our global nature, and that we need to bring a global perspective to healthcare issues, and to continue to recognize the importance of the biological sciences as well as population sciences if we are to advance medicine. Next slide, please. Now, 2025 is not that far away. When we created this slide, it seemed like a long time ago, but worldwide, we want physicians who are competent healthcare clinicians for patients and populations, as I just suggested, who can communicate easily and well, who are leaders but also capable of working with interprofessional teams, and who are fluent with digital data and technology. So I think we can all agree that these are shared attributes that we want from physicians. And part of what we have experienced is a fundamental shift in the way we think about healthcare and patients, as well as healthcare and learners. Next slide, please. We have a changed paradigm. I should make this slide a changed, not changing. We've gone from one of the physician being very paternalistic to having a partnership with the patient. Our teaching is much more learner-centered. Our patient care is much more patient-centered. And instead of constantly seeking a cure, we're focusing on prevention and wellness. And the role of the physician is one of collaborator with other healthcare professionals, not strictly the leader of the team. Next slide, please. Other things that we have learned and that have changed in the 21st century is the recognition that medical school may be a finite amount of time. It may be 6 years, but that the development of the physician is a lifetime process, and that we have to think about, I use the word formation of a physician from a learning paradigm that allows the individual to have the skills to continue to be a lifelong learner and to change as the science changes and as our knowledge base changes. And one critical component that we need to think about, and I would encourage you as you're thinking about your curriculum to give this careful thought, is the role of mentors. People do what they see. And we need to foster positive relationships between our healthcare learners and those who are providing the education. And this is where I think the formation of people who are truly patient-centered requires that we foster a student-centered learning experience. So I want to talk a bit about competencies since Eliana asked me to speak about that. Next slide, please. We've been talking about competencies for centuries. I had the privilege of working and living in the Middle East for a number of years, and this idea that in the Arab world, some of the first competencies were thousands of years ago. The students who are fit to study medicine are those who are healthy and intelligent. They must be compassionate, charitable, sensitive, indefatigable, devoid of envy, jealousy, anger, laziness, gluttony, gossip. They should be clean, good-mannered, self-restrained, chaste, strong-willed, and perseverant. We might use different words to describe our competencies now, but I suspect that many of the qualities identified in this set correspond to what we're looking for now. Next slide, please. We have thought a great deal about how we acquire abilities. And in the 1990s, Dr. George Miller created a hierarchy of abilities that begins with what the student or practitioner knows, that competence is that they demonstrate they know how to apply the knowledge, the performances that they can do, they can perform and show whatever the knowledge is that shows their competence. And finally, practice. That is the lifelong approach to patient care. Next slide, please. Another way to think about this competency development is the two competing types of program development that I believe we have in medical schools now. We have a time-based approach and we have an outcomes-based approach. And I think the challenge is how we maintain the best qualities of both of these approaches, even though they're competing a bit. The time-based focuses on admissions, who we admit, how the curriculum is organized, and the outcomes-based focuses on the functional capabilities of the graduates. And we need to find a way to balance the two. So I'd like to consider that for the next few minutes. Next slide. Many groups have worked to define the competent physician. These are some from the US and Canada, but in Brazil as well, the national curriculum was set forth, and I've had the opportunity to work with several Brazilian medical schools working on grants that the National Board of Medical Examiners provided, focusing on the assessment of competencies. So the Brazilian medical schools are leading the way in this area as well. But the point of this slide is that in the 20th and the 21st century, there's been a lot of work done to try to define the competent physician. Next slide, please. The World Health Organization, the US-based Institute of Medicine, also have identified core competencies for health professionals. And this slide simply demonstrates the similarity between an international organization, the World Health Organization, and a US-based organization, that we want patient-centered care, partnering with other healthcare professionals and healthcare organizations to improve the quality of healthcare and to excel at information and communication technology, and also, as I've said before, to bring a public health perspective to the work. Next slide, please. In 2010, the Carnegie Foundation in the United States published what was considered a report to look at all of the medical education in the United States, and it was a call for change in medical school and residency. And there were two key elements that came out of this. One, that we standardize learning outcomes and at the same time individualize the learning process, as well as finding ways to better integrate formal knowledge and clinical experience. Next slide, please. So the challenge was that medical education was not truly outcomes-based, and that we needed to standardize these learning outcomes through the assessment of competencies. And at the same time, medical education was inflexible, it was rigid, you sat in the seat for an amount of time, you took an exam, you moved on. And so the challenge, the recommendation was to individualize learning processes and allow progression when the competencies were achieved. So next slide, please. So I would submit that these approaches, having defined outcome standards and a learning process that is individualized, is perhaps a dual imperative, because I think that medical educators seem uncertain as to whether students, residents, and those in practice are competent, and this is due to an insufficient amount of outcome measures. But at the same time, they feel the need to develop educational programs that are tailored to individuals with feedback that are flexible in time. And so the approaches we are considering, and I would encourage you to think about, are about the culture, about the context, and about socialization. And while the adoption of standardization is more efficient and is the dominant approach, and the individualized approach is more research intense and less likely to be the model used, we have a major challenge before us. Next slide, please. So Dr. Carol Caraccio and Dr. Robert Englander in the United States have done a great deal of work looking at competency-based medical education. And they've identified some key lessons and challenges that we need to think about. One is that competency-based medical education is not understood fully by everyone. We need a standardized language to be clear about what we mean when we say competency-based medical education. They have suggested that direct observation that is guided brings great potential for accurately assessing competence. But as I suggested from the last slide, this is very resource intensive. We need outcomes that will drive the curriculum, but that can be measured. And the role of the learner in competency-based education has to be emphasized. And again, this is a challenge. Developing competence requires training in competent systems. And one of the elements of the 21st century medical school that I showed is something about the healthcare system and healthcare sciences. We need to recognize the importance of the healthcare system in which the learner is trained. And finally, and something I want to spend some time talking about, meaningful assessment of competency-based education requires a range of measures to accurately assess performance. Next slide, please. As you think about your new curriculum, we need to recognize that in the competency-based education model, as opposed to the traditional model, we have the health needs and the health systems that define the competencies and outcomes we want that are then assessed, and those elements make up the curriculum. Previously, we said, here's the curriculum we want, here are educational outcomes, here's how we're going to assess. But we need to incorporate the health system to be accurate and to truly have a competency-based system. Next slide, please. And Joanna, thank you for doing this. Go ahead and click on all of the buttons. I had changed this previously. So we have learned a number of lessons about assessment, and that is that studies have shown that any change you make in an assessment method will have a greater effect on student learning than a change in curriculum. So I want to encourage you to think about aligning anything you do with the curriculum with the assessment program, because the assessment methods influence the way faculty teach, the way students study, and the way and assessments have to have consequences to be effective. And that's a key component that we need to think about in competency-based education, because we want to have feedback that will allow the learner to grow and at a certain point have consequences of those assessments. So I'd like to talk about some principles to guide a new assessment system. Next slide, please. If we think about it, several organizations in the US have begun to recognize the need for a more coherent and integrated system of assessment that really focuses on the importance of learning by involving the student through providing feedback, helping the faculty member give feedback, helping the student receive feedback. And in this way, assessment itself becomes a teachable moment. And so the critical nature of feedback and thinking about how we can use that to help the learner accomplish the outcomes we want in the curriculum is a critical component of competency-based education. And what this does is it shifts the accountability for learning and assessment towards one of shared responsibility between the learner and the educational program. Next slide, please. So I'd like to leave you with a few thoughts to consider since Eliana asked me to think about the way forward. Next slide, please. Dr. Norsini talked about external evaluations. And this is a diagram of something that I worked on in a previous role at the National Board of Medical Examiners, where we were thinking about all of the components that could make up assessments that would then lead to a competency-based approach that could contribute to the development of external evaluations and go with the learner into practice through the use of a portfolio. Next slide, please. So a portfolio has been defined as a learner-centered framework. And again, the importance of focusing on the learner is key here. It provides a large selection of data that allow the learner to reflect, to self-assess, allows the faculty member, the teacher to provide mentoring, to follow the student and see how they are doing, identifying areas that need work. Next slide, please. We gather a great deal of information about students. And in residency, most of this information is simply ignored, and it doesn't exist when the individual is in practice. We just say, oh, the student is good enough, they've passed the exam. And so by having a portfolio, we are not presenting assessments as hurdles that the learner must overcome, but rather providing approaches that allow them to look at the learning objectives, to illustrate their proficiency, to self-assess, to reflect, and ultimately to provide a summative evaluation for academic achievement, credit, residency selection, whatever is necessary. Next slide, please. A learning plan is one approach that demonstrates an integrated and continuous model of assessment across medical school into residency and practice, where the information is carried forward with the individual. And this would optimize the profession's capacity to really hone in on the aspects of performance that would have the most impact for an individual learner at a particular time, and would promote the idea that learners need to be accountable and maintain responsibility for their own learning. This way, we're not dichotomizing performance into pass-fail, but this recognizes the continuous nature of performance, and all learners, whether they pass or not, could maintain a learning plan that would guide their own and their teachers, mentors, activities in a way that could really be efficient, minimize wasted time and energy. This requires students to illustrate how their learning contributes to their own and their patients' benefit, and creates an incentive for the students to view their learning as a lifelong effort that requires a continuous reinvestment rather than simply trusting that they know something because they passed an exam. Next slide, please. Some of the ways that an institution can support these learner-centered and learning plan approaches is to recognize the critical role that faculty play as role models and allow the faculty time for self-reflection and learning from their interaction with the students and their own experiences. And again, this focuses attention beyond the individual to the institutional culture that you've created and the values that your curriculum and your program model. We also need to think about negative role modeling and the opportunity for students to have safe spaces to reflect upon what needs to change with negative role modeling and how that can be reported. Next slide, please. So we always want to know if what we're doing is working yet and what are the measures that we can use. And I want to encourage you as you're thinking about change to document both the goals of your educational program and the educational impacts that you achieve through changes that you have made. What's working, what's not working, how can we determine this? And is the data that you are collecting fulfilling the goals of the educational program that you have defined? We often collect a lot of data and we don't apply it to needed changes. So I just want to encourage you to think about that. Next slide, please. Finally, the U.S. Journal of Graduate Medical Education has published an article that talks about, again, medical educator job roles in 2025, which is not that far away. But I leave you with this as the almost last slide to think about the different roles that the medical educator will need to have going into this competency-based approach and assessment to be able to use the results of the data to look at gaps, exactly what I've been talking about. They've given them some fancy names, but a content curator to access, select, organize, and deliver the content developed by people at the school as well as national experts. Learner-centered navigator and professional coach to be able to guide the learner's use of resources and practice to achieve the outcomes that you've identified for the curriculum. So some of these are fancy words to describe what you're already doing, but again, it's a shift in the way that faculty need to think about their roles, and the institution needs to recognize how the roles of the faculty have changed. Final slide. I just want to say obrigada and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you very much, Brownie. I think you brought the reflection about what competence is about and the roles that we have to take to drive to a different perspective in medical education. I think it's very useful for our reflections, and will certainly bring certain questions that already started. So from now on, let's move to our last presenter, and then we have the round of discussion. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Stanley Hamstra, a friend from years, and he's talking about the role of simulation in medical programs. So Stan, very welcome to be here. It's very nice to see you again.
Thank you very much, Eliana. Thank you everyone for inviting me. I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach. I'm going to tell a story. Really, it's my story about competency-based medical education. So I hope you can see my slide. I'm presenting from here. So you see my title slide? Okay, thanks.
Perfect.
Yeah, simulation. Okay, thank you.
Simulation-based medical education has been part of my career for 25 years. I started at the University of Toronto in 1997, so almost exactly 25 years ago. And I'll tell this story about what I've experienced using simulation, both for training, undergraduates, for residents and specialists, and also for assessment. And then I'll highlight that story with a few studies that I think are key experiments that we did in simulation-based medical education research. So I just want to focus on the training and assessment for undergraduate medical education for today. And given your mandate with Unicamp and your network of collaborators across Brazil, I think this question is very relevant. You have 6 years of training. It's a bit different than the US system and Canadian system. And this question, are they ready for practice, I think is especially important for you in Brazil. So let me tell you what I found out, and hopefully this helps. So this is where I am today. I'm a professor of surgery at the University of Toronto. I'm an employee of the Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center, but I also retained a linkage to Northwestern University in Chicago, and I also have retained a research consultant position with the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education in Chicago. So I've been working both in the US and in Canada over these last 25 years. I started in the University of Toronto in the Department of Surgery, where I mostly did research on technical skills. The surgeons were very interested in understanding how they could train the residents early in their program to build basic technical skills. And one of the things that Richard Resnick and Glenn Regehr did right around the time just before I arrived was they built something called the OSATs, the Objective Structured Assessment of Technical Skills. And that was very useful for assessment of surgical skills, and it's become very popular in assessment in general in medical education. And I think it needs to be updated and revised at this point. I think we need to be looking beyond just technical skills. I think we need to look beyond the OSATs for assessment, and I'll tell you a little bit about that story. Then I was at the University of Michigan, where it was more broad than education. My mandate involved developing reliable and valid assessment tools, not just for surgery, but for all specialty programs, and to share the best practices for assessment among residency programs. So this was not just for simulation, but it mostly focused on simulation-based teaching and assessment. And I also did a lot of teaching of faculty how to do education research. And I supervised a number of master's students who were already practicing faculty. Then I was at the University of Ottawa for 5 years, where I was assistant dean for medical education. At that time, I had the opportunity to become director of the simulation center that they were building at the University of Ottawa. And they had quite an investment in that. So that was very attractive to me. And I got to design programs around simulation-based medical education in Ottawa back in Canada. And then I also had an opportunity to work with the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada to talk about assessment and CanMed's roles and competency by design as they were developing that. So as you can see, I've switched across the border between Canada and the US a number of times now. I can understand the culture, I think, a little bit in both countries. And it is different, I have to assure you. I know maybe from Brazil, they look like the same culture. But there are some differences that are, I think, pretty important. I spent the last 5 years with the ACGME, where I was vice president of milestones research and evaluation, and we oversaw the accreditation of residency training programs in the United States. And here I am back in Toronto, where I'm doing, again, research on the assessment of technical skills, but now we're going to go into something that John mentioned at the end of his talk on patient outcomes. So we're trying to predict patient outcomes in a very specific area. We're looking at hip fractures at this point. We have over 600 hip fracture surgeries, hip replacement surgeries at our hospital every year. So we're trying to see if we can predict what happens in the operating room, whether that predicts the outcomes for the patients in hip fracture surgery. So today I'll talk about simulation for teaching. I'll touch briefly on cost effectiveness, because I think that's important in designing simulation for teaching, but also I'll speak about simulation for assessment. So I think this really does need a little bit of a historical background, because with this context, I think you can see where simulation really plays a role in medical education. And there's been some wonderful scholarship on this over the past 15 years or so. And what they have basically found is that the nature of medical practice changed considerably since the 1980s. And that forced the changes in medical education. And what I see from where I sit in medical education is that simulation can be a good response to these changes that we saw in medical education. Let me illustrate what I mean. So historically, and I think Brownie touched on this with her historical slide on what the competencies should be, way back to 2,000 years ago. But it started out as an apprenticeship for sure. The medical education has been an apprenticeship for most of its career. There hasn't been a structured competency-based system to medical education, but I think we've evolved now. Society has evolved, and the way that healthcare delivery has changed has forced us away from this apprenticeship model. So this is a wonderful book by Ken Ludmer called Time to Heal, which I would recommend for everyone who's interested in the history of medical education. And it focuses on the United States. It's American medical education. But I think these effects have reverberated around the world. What happened in the United States in the 1980s was a transition to managed care. And what that did was try to standardize the practice of medicine, healthcare delivery, in a way that would make it more efficient and less costly. So I often think about how costly healthcare would be now if we hadn't had that focus on managed care at the time and concerns about efficiency and cost control. But that was a big revolution in medical education, in healthcare delivery, and then it affected medical education as well. So the thing that happened around the same time or just after was an increased emphasis on individual accountability. There was an Institute of Medicine report that said that over 80,000 patient deaths were preventable or due to medical error, and that we should focus on patient safety. And there were, as a consequence of that and other things like Libby Zion case in New York State in the late 1980s, there were duty hour restrictions imposed on residents. What all of this did was force the learner further away from the faculty. So the person who was actually delivering patient care in the healthcare institution had to focus more on efficiency and accountability. And with the duty hour restrictions, it took the learners even further away from the attending physicians in these large healthcare systems, especially in the large teaching hospitals. That was a problem for medical education, because now that the apprenticeship model was basically eroded, you couldn't spend as much time with your advisor and with your mentor. There had to be another way of training, another way of assessment. So the consequences of this were the move towards competency-based medical education. And Brownie did a nice job of outlining exactly what that is. Beyond medical education, there's also an emphasis on maintenance of competence. So if you're working with the American Board of Internal Medicine or other boards, specialty boards, you may have noticed that there is a strong emphasis now on demonstrating competence throughout your career. And this is going to be with us for a long time. So how do you standardize that? How do you make sure, without this apprenticeship model and this focus on competencies, that we can actually teach things according to these competencies, and that we can assess those skills according to this competency-based framework? And this is where simulation has a big role to play, I think. So simulation for teaching. I think you can start with recognize how effective simulation can be for teaching basic skills. And here you have simple skills being taught in a lab with you don't even need an expert instructor. You can have someone who is slightly more advanced teaching their peer. We call this near peer training, where they can teach someone who's just below them in their class. As well as technical skills around procedures. You can use simulators to teach very basic things around auscultation, even resuscitation, delivery. And these simulators come with, of course, vital signs for both the mother and the baby. So these can be very effective tools. And in response to all of the research that was being published on simulation, David Cook from the Mayo Clinic and myself assembled a team to do a systematic review and meta-analysis of all simulation-based research up to that date. And this was published in 2011, so it's now 10 years old. But it's still being cited very frequently, and has been somewhat of a landmark in the field of simulation-based medical education. So I'll spend a few minutes on this paper. Of course, it needs to be updated, and there's lots of room for extending the research from this paper. But what we attempted to do at the time was identify whether simulation-based training was effective or not. That simple question, based on the research that we could see to date, did the studies indicate that simulation was effective in training? And if so, what types of skills? What types of simulation? So once you start asking that questions that broadly, you realize that you have to narrow them a little bit. So we focused on technology-enhanced simulation as opposed to things like using simulated patients or OSCEs or that type of thing. So our definition for simulation technologies was it either had to be a computer-based virtual reality simulator, programmable interactive mannequin, some kind of plastic model. Live animals were also considered if they were using live animals for simulation of human tissue. Inert animal products, and this is where you can put animal biotissue in a frame, and you can use that to practice your surgical skills, for example. And of course, human cadavers are also a form of simulation. And we considered these to be the simulation technologies that would guide our review. We were a little surprised to see that when we did the initial abstract screening, that there were over 10,000 articles published on simulation-based medical education up to that point. This was in 2010. We quickly reviewed all 10,000. So this team, that's why we had a team of 8 of us, because we had to review so many abstracts. And we ended up with 2,583 articles that we could screen fully. And then 985 articles where we coded all of the information from the articles in full according to our criteria. And we found that there were 609 articles that compared simulation to no intervention, which was our main objective for this paper. There were 92 articles that compared simulation to non-simulation. That was interesting because if you compare something to no intervention, you would expect there to be some kind of effect because as any educator will tell you, teaching is probably better than not teaching. 92 articles comparing simulation to non-simulation, and 289 articles, and this is where it kind of gets interesting, comparing simulation of different types. And these were published in separate papers, and I'll just go through these at a very high level summary for you right now. But I would encourage you to find this paper by Cook from 2011 if you're interested in the details. This is something that I had published as well. That's been very well known. It's not my original idea, but this Kirkpatrick hierarchy of outcomes, where you can look at level 1 outcome is participation or satisfaction. Level 2 outcome can be a change in attitudes or perceptions. Level 2B could be a change in knowledge or skills. Level 3 is a change in behaviors. Level 4A, a change in practice. And level 4B, which is the highest level of evidence for outcomes, is benefits to patients. And this is, again, what John Norsini was talking about. So, yeah, does someone have a question? Yes, Eliana, do you have a question?
No, don't worry.
Okay, okay, all right. Okay, so these are the outcomes that we were looking at. You know, does simulation have an impact on participation, attitudes, knowledge, skills, behaviors, change in practice? This is change in medical practice or benefits to patients. These are very high criteria, level 4, that we wouldn't have expected to find with these studies. But we were hoping to find something about changes in attitudes, skills, and behaviors from simulation. And so that's what we focused on. And so what we found was that compared to no simulation, and this is the 609 studies comparing simulation to no intervention, that there is a strong effect of simulation when you look at knowledge. So the pooled effect size is 1.2, is very significant. All of these changes were very significant. And this is kind of the average effect size of all of these studies. And this is the number of studies that we found. So 118 papers looked at changes in knowledge as a result of simulation involving over 8,500 trainees, changes in skill as measured by time, changes in skill as measured by process. This would be something about whether they are doing the skill correctly or not. This is by far the most common way of assessing the outcome of simulation. There are almost 21,000 trainees represented in these 426 studies. Now you can also look at changes in skill as a function of the product. In other words, you know, was the suturing done well? Was the anastomosis done correctly? So when you're looking at technical skills, you can start looking at outcomes in terms of the product. You can also look at behavior in terms of time, process, and you can also look at patient effects. And we actually found 32 studies that looked at patient effects. So whether the simulation had an impact on patients. And this was mostly things like a successful intubation or something like that with patients. So outside of the simulation center. What we found is all of these showed a fairly strong effect of simulation versus no intervention. So is simulation an effective training tool? Well, yes, it is. I mean, there's lots of evidence to show, and this just confirms what we expected to see. Now, when we break it down by different types of simulation, we found quite a variety of outcomes. So if you're looking at skills as an outcome, and you focus on simulation using clinical variation. So there were 16 studies that actually looked at whether during simulation you were presented with different options or different types of patients. As a simulation-based teaching strategy, that can be very effective in teaching simulation-based skills. We didn't find any significant difference whether you had clinical variation in your simulation-based learning or not. When you started looking at things like cognitive interactivity, in other words, were you engaging the trainees in a cognitive way to ask questions about what they were practicing on and whether or not they understood the reason for their training, it was a very strong effect that if you include this type of activity in your simulation platform, you will see a strong effect of simulation-based training. Other things like distributed practice seem to have an effect. Feedback, of course, had a strong effect. Interestingly, when you started looking at group practice, it actually almost had a negative significant effect. So that was something that we were quite surprised at. But when you think about technical skills, and that was mostly what we were looking at, that's not maybe as much of a surprise. So we weren't looking at using simulation to train team or group work. And this might have come out quite differently if we were looking at that. And you can see these different other aspects of how simulation how the learning was actually constructed, how the lesson plans were created, what elements of an effective lesson plan they had really impacted whether or not these trainees were judged to be better after their simulation intervention or not. So you can also use simulation for advanced skills. So that was basic skills where I think you could use any of those types of strategies in an undergraduate curriculum quite successfully. For advanced skills, of course, you can start training things that are a little bit more advanced, and maybe this is for your 5th and 6th year students, starting to practice the laparoscopic techniques or arthroscopic techniques or colonoscopy or endoscopy. There's lots of simulators available to do that. Most of them have been designed and revised now that they're quite effective at training these skills. But of course, you need to have the transfer. You need to be able to demonstrate that they can do this with real patients, and I'll speak about that in a minute. So this is an actual surgery of a parathyroid operation where, this is quite advanced surgery. It's difficult to teach because the surgical field is so small. It's obviously very important because often the parathyroid tissue will be cancerous while the surrounding thyroid tissue will not be cancerous. So you have to distinguish those two organs during surgery. And that's very hard to train because it's such a small surgical field. So that is something for advanced skills that we call low frequency, high acuity, or difficult access, that maybe we could build a simulation platform for something like that. But at the end of the day, you have to look at the clinical context and deconstruct that. You have to essentially reverse engineer what is happening in the actual clinical setting and then try and represent that in your simulation platform. And I'll talk about that because I've done a lot of thinking about that in terms of transfer of learning and fidelity as well. So this is not a patient, although it looks pretty close to a patient. This is actually animal tissue that's been put into a box. This is a Tupperware container. And we had a product development lab at the University of Ottawa where we actually developed a system for providing traction and counter traction to the animal tissue inside a box. And that essentially allowed us to set up the simulation so that there were patients' vital signs that could be monitored by the surgeon, but also they had a chance to interact with live tissue. And that was extremely realistic and effective. And those things, that's actually pretty cheap to do. You can see how realistic it looks, but it's actually not that expensive because you can get animal tissue at the butcher shop, and you just have to think about how you're going to provide the exposure using these synthetic materials and the traction and counter traction. And this is what I would call low fidelity, high impact, low cost simulation-based training platform. So you can see, I like this picture because this is the instructor and this is the resident. The instructor is starting the procedure and the resident is reaching over and starting to take over completely and pushing the instructor out of the way. So that's, to me, a sign of a very good simulation platform, because if the instructor, if the trainee starts to take over and push the instructor out of the way, you know that they're very much engaged in their learning. And you can do all kinds of other things now with simulation, of course, as well. You can do not only surgical skills, obviously, you can do critical care and crisis management skills. And these mannequins are now very well programmed and have algorithms which allow for this. Now, the one thing I do want to talk about is this idea of fidelity. And this paper came out of this review that we did. So I was the first author on this one. It was published in Academic Medicine in 2014, and this has also been cited widely now. But this is basically a critical review of the concept of fidelity. And so basically the bottom line is that, you know, it doesn't have to be expensive or high tech to have high fidelity. So I think if you're running a simulation-based program for your medical students anywhere in Brazil, I think you could just if you put some thought into how to design the simulation platform to match the skills that you're looking at, that's way more effective than simply going shopping for an expensive mannequin. And this paper provides some conceptual background about how to do that. Here's an example of one that was published way back in 2002, but it's still highly cited because it was such an extreme example. This was my surgery research fellow came into my office one day, Eddie Matsumoto, and he put his feet up on my desk, and I said, well, who is this guy, you know? And I said, what do you want to do for a research project? And he said, well, I want to build a urology simulator. And I thought, okay, this is a junior resident with wanting to do a master's degree. And I said to myself, I didn't say it out loud, but I said, okay, if you go away and get $600,000 and do a PhD in engineering and come back in 5 years, I can do that with you. But instead of saying that, I said, okay, let's get going. And so what we did was we compared this, what we had at the time, the high fidelity simulator for a mid-ureteric stone extraction. So this is a urology procedure using a ureteroscope. We compared this platform for teaching with a camera and you know, simulated human anatomy with this platform. So we made this for $2. You know, I think I gave Eddie $10, and I said, find the lowest technology material that you can, and we'll build our own and see if we can train people to the same level. So he went to the cafeteria and he stole a coffee cup and he got a Penrose drain from the OR and 2 McDonald's straws, and he put little holes in them so we could put the mid-ureteric stone, and we put it in a latex base. And we compared the effectiveness of those two approaches, and what we found was that the training was similar. So when we assessed their performance after training on this model or that model, we actually found that their performance was similar. And that was a randomized control trial involving 40 medical students who were interested in urology. So again, I think the main message there is around cost effectiveness. So, and when we did the systematic review on cost effectiveness, we found that only 6% of the studies that we looked at even considered cost in reporting, which is quite a shame because these simulators are being sold as a solution to a curriculum gap, but there's very little evidence that they are effective compared to other interventions in simulations. So I would encourage you to be quite critical about when you're buying a simulation system. And you can look up this study to look at the cost effectiveness. But the main message here is that you have to think about this educational principle that we call transfer of learning. It's a very common theme in educational psychology and educational theory, but how do you transfer learning from one platform to another? So simulation in medical education provides a very clean laboratory for asking that question. Can we transfer skills from the simulator to the clinical setting? Well, that's an empirical question. Sometimes you can, and sometimes you can't. And the answer is in how you design a simulation training scenario. So again, I would say, think about what you're trying to teach in the clinical setting, and then go back and design the simulator to teach those things, instead of just buying a simulator with the hope that it's going to teach everything that you want. And when you start asking these questions around transfer of learning, by the way, it leads to scholarship and also management of simulation centers. And I've written a chapter on all of this. I'll share the reference with you at the end of my talk. So I think the bottom line of my presentation would be effective simulation is not just a building or high-tech equipment. You know, it should be treated as another educational tool. Simulation is just another educational tool. You need to be critical. What are you trying to teach and why? And get into those details. Are you using this resource in the best way possible? How do you know it was effective? So that leads to the scholarship question, you know, and the question that Brownie asked towards the end of her talk about, you know, document the impact of the changes that you've made. So look for clues to effectiveness and think about evaluation of anything that you include in your curriculum, including simulation, and then can you improve on the process? So I think simulation is just another educational tool. It's not something different. So the major questions are really, is simulation effective? And I think, yes, you know, simulation is effective. I think that was the short answer that I gave from that systematic review. But the real more detailed, important questions are, what type of simulation is effective for a given clinical skill? And that requires a little bit more thought. This is what I call the second order questions, the derivative questions, if you like calculus. And how can we make it more effective? And that's always, you have to always be thinking about how to improve your curriculum, and simulation is no different. And then the second big question for research and simulation is it cost effective, and how can we make it more cost effective? I would say spending $10 on a coffee cup and straws is way more cost effective than spending $4,000 on the plastic mannequin from Limbs and Things. So I have a few minutes left. I'm going to talk about assessment, and it's interesting. So this question is not resolved. So I'm just going to explore some studies and some themes, and maybe leave you with some questions on the assessment of skills and how simulation is useful for assessment. And if you think about assessment more broadly, there are all kinds of things to consider, and any psychometrician will tell you this. As a clinician educator or as a lead, you don't need to know all these details, but you should at least be aware of them. Assessment really isn't about a tool, it's a process. So I think most people who've worked in this field long enough will agree that assessment is a process. It involves a rater often, unless you're writing a standardized exam. There are rater biases. You know, is there institutional support for educational work? This is very important. This gets into rater motivation. Is there an opportunity to observe the trainee? Are the assessment tools feasible? What is the quality of those assessment tools? I can't stress enough how important this feasibility question is. I think a lot of assessment tools are made by psychologists or psychometrists and then presented to the clinician, and they don't really understand them. And so if you really want a good feasible assessment tool, you have to partner with the clinician educators to make sure that they're involved in the design of the assessment tool. The attitude of the trainees towards being assessed, and there's a whole other literature on construct-aligned scales. I don't think I'll have time to get into that, but just to let you know that that's also an interesting thing to think about. Yeah, so I'll skip this part. Using simulation for assessment is really about all of these things. Is it clinically relevant? Are you using it for high stakes, etc. So I had published this checklist for developing a good assessment instrument earlier in this academic emergency medicine paper. This is not really something that's original. I kind of tweaked it a bit from other things that I had read, but people asked me to write this. So I came up with this list of how to develop a good assessment instrument. And essentially, there's an iterative loop, this should guide you in developing any kind of assessment tool. And of course, for simulation, it would have more or less the same structure. But always measure reliability and validity every time you assess and collect data. So here is the original OSATS tool that we had used in Toronto. I won't spend much time on this other than just to show it as a historical document. You can see that for technical skills, respect for tissue, time and motion, instrument handling, etc. These are very robust dimensions of performance. A lot of these have held up over time and over lots of research. So I think we were on the right track in some ways, but there is way too much uncertainty and confusion around the wording in the behavioral anchors. So we came up with something else when I was in Ottawa called the Ottawa Surgical Competency Operating Room Evaluation, or the O-score. And this is something to think about. So if you have these slides and if you have time or you want this reference, I can paste it in the chat box later. But this one by Wade Gofton on the O-score is a very interesting study in the evolution of an assessment tool. This is something that we asked the surgeons to describe what they thought of the residents who they were operating with that day. And they basically came up with these 5 statements. You know, I did not need to be there. This resident could have done it themselves. Or I needed to be in the room just in case. Or I had to prompt them from time to time. I had to talk them through every step, or I had to do the procedure myself. So this is the kind of language that comes naturally to the surgeon when they're watching a resident perform in the operating room, or maybe even an advanced medical student. It's not the kind of language that a psychometrist would come up with. So this is what I mean by construct-aligned scales, or these are also, you could think of these as entrustability scales. There's also a great review. It's now 6 years old, but this is a wonderful review by Iman Gadari and colleagues from University of Illinois, Chicago, where I think he was doing his master's degree. But there's a whole review of technical skills assessment, and they use this unitary framework of validity to assess each of the assessment tools that they review. So that's very nice. So I'll end on this one study that I just wanted to tell you about, because I think one of the questions that Ileana asked me about was, should simulation be used for high stakes assessment? And you know, that's an interesting question. High stakes assessment is always going to be constrained, like certification, board certification, or specialty certification exams are always going to be constrained by the fact that you have so many people writing these exams at the same time. And simulation is very difficult to use as an assessment because of those large numbers. What we did, but I think in theory, what I've found over my career, especially in the last 5 years, is that simulation should be considered more and more as an adjunct to the oral exam or the viva, right? I think that there is a place for simulation as an assessment tool of skills before the trainees go out into practice on their own, independently or unsupervised. And this study with Savadelli, we actually compared. So George Savadelli was one of those other residents who came to Toronto to work with us. And I don't have a picture of him with his feet on my desk, but he came and said, you know, sometimes I see anesthesia residents who are really good at performing in the oral exam, but I wouldn't choose them to be my doctor in a trauma situation, right? And other people who he thought had excellent skills in managing a crisis didn't score highest on the oral exam. So that brings to question whether the oral exam for certification is really the best way to assess, because who do you want to do manage your crisis? You don't necessarily want the person who can talk the talk, you want the person who can walk the walk. So this study was about that. And what we basically found, I don't know if you're interested in generalizability theory, but this is one way of presenting it. I could have presented it with a correlation matrix as well, but basically what this is 40% of the variance in this study was determined by the examinee, and that's what you want. You want the assessment tool to be able to discriminate between examinees. That's why you have high stakes assessment. You want to discriminate between examinees. You want to pull out the top performers and the bottom performers. But here's where it gets interesting in the highlighted part. What this basically says is that if the examinees were, it didn't matter if the examinees were doing a resuscitation, managing a resuscitation scenario or a crisis in a trauma, whether they were doing a resuscitation in the simulation bay or managing a trauma scenario, they basically did the same. So very little variance was accounted for by this interaction. But what it does show is that the examinees did better. It depended on the modality. So whether they were doing the oral exam or the simulation-based exam almost determined their performance as much as the examinee, the main effect. So what this is saying is that some examinees, it confirmed George Savadeli's intuition, this was empirical now, that some examinees do much better on oral exams, but they don't do as well in the simulator. And some examinees do much better in the simulator-based exam, but they don't do as well in the oral exam. So that, to me, suggests that we need to have some kind of simulator-based component in the high-stakes exam. So that's that. That's that study. Just give you some thought. So assessment beyond technical skills, obviously I've focused mostly on technical skills because that's been my career, but obviously you can think about all of these things, patient evaluation before any kind of treatment, the differential diagnosis, problem-solving ability, application of knowledge, ability to deal with a changing situation. I think this is something that I really love. If we could have items that assess this, I think most clinicians will tell you that, the resident or the advanced medical student who can adapt to a changing clinical situation, they're generally going to be very successful. And of course, communication skills, professionalism, and so on. And this comes from Kearney, from Canadian Journal, Canadian Journal of Anesthesia from 2002. So I have a new book chapter on this topic if you want to follow up. It's published in a book from the University of Toronto Press just this year. This is the chapter, I call it The Natural History of Simulation Centers, Educational Support Systems or Expressions of Technology. And basically it's this story that I just told you with more details. But basically what I'm saying is that it's not just about shopping. I mean, don't think of simulation as a solution to your curriculum. It needs to be done thoughtfully. You need to think about what you're trying to teach and how to integrate simulation into your curriculum. And then obviously for assessment, it's critically important as well. And that's the book, the book cover if you're looking for it. So thank you very much. And now I'm happy to yield my presentation and answer questions. And there's my email address and QR code and Twitter handle if you want to contact me later. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. I'm sure that you'll be contacted by our group. I already received a lot of comments on the excellent presentation that, again, as the other previous presenters, is giving a lot of food for thought. Sure. So I have some questions here that came from the audience, and I will ask first if Claudio Zeferino, someone that is into this room with us, wants to make some question, and then I have some comments and questions from the audience.
Hello, Eliana.
Yes. Yes, Joanna.
Yes, I'd like to ask some very simple questions. The first one is to Professor Nocini. Is just ask him for an advice. How he thinks that we can engage the community in going towards these parameters of good medical schools. Of course, I think that what he told is so in the tune in Brazilian education. So knowing the needs of the healthcare system and having a real purpose of the medical education. We have a problem here that our project is to form general doctors, and we have about 300 specialists that are in charge of educating these generalists. So I think that this is a challenge, of course, but we have an amazing community, and for me, it is so transformative to know the world parameters for a good medical school. So I would like an advice how to engage the community on knowing, and what are the first steps. Of course, I have one question for Professor Brani and for Professor Stanley, but I don't know, I think it's better for us to hear Professor Nocini.
So I think that's a really good question, and I'm not sure I have any spectacular answers to it. I actually think in Brazil, you're far ahead of certainly the United States in being responsive to the community and engaging with community leaders as you develop a mission and as you evaluate the medical school, I think is a very reasonable way to go forward. Having public members engaged with the medical school is quite important. On the other side, and I think that when you evaluate the outcomes of the medical school, one of the things you want to think about evaluating are things that you value. So for example, I know some medical schools that value primary care because that's part of their mission, an important part of their mission. And so what they actually do is they follow the trainees, the graduates, into practice to see how many end up there. In addition, I know the rural setting is important to you. It's important in the US as well. One of the things medical schools have started to do is follow their graduates to see how many actually end up in those communities, associating that with the education they have, and then using it going forward. So I think there are two ways. One is to engage the community to begin with, having members participate with you to the degree that that makes sense, and also following up on your graduates to see what they actually do.
Thank you, Professor Nocini. It will be a long way, but I think it will be a very productive and very transforming for our community here. Thank you a lot. Your microphone is closed.
Yep. I have here another question to John that I think it would be useful to put now. People are talking in our lots of compliments, and people are really excited about the three presenters, but there is a question about our system, and you may know a little bit of our system, how we decide that a medical school is good in Brazil. We have a Ministry of Education system that has self-assessment and external evaluation as well, but it's also based on a kind of exam that is ENAD. And then we have a parallel system that is more on the accreditation side. But the main point here is related to what Joanna said, because someone asked, well, so if we have to have for all the systems, evaluators, assessors that come to schools, how can we prepare these assessors to have the best and the more homogeneous overview of the medical schools, considering that we have now in Brazil more than 300 of them around the country with different missions sometimes.
So I think that there are two pieces to that answer. One is I'm sure you've settled on a group of standards that you want to apply. I think that's absolutely critical. The second piece that I think is just as important is to make sure that the visitors to the schools are trained. So making sure that they have extensive training in what it is they're doing. The third thing I think is to make sure that there are a sufficient number visiting each medical school. One assessor, no matter what the situation, is not enough. So having several assessors is really important. And the fourth piece of this, I think, is to make sure that you evaluate those assessors over time and you provide them feedback on what their performance is compared to their peers. One of the things that we have been very bad in doing in assessment, whether it be of institutions or individuals, is that those folks who are engaged in assessment are very rarely given feedback about how they perform relative to each other or relative to whatever standards you have for those assessors. So I think it's really absolutely critical that they be provided feedback. So you have to have a set of standards, you have to train the assessors, you have to make sure there's an appropriate number, and then you have to provide them feedback around their performance.
Good, thank you, thank you. I know that Joanna has more questions for everybody. Let me put some question for Brownie. People comment that one of the slides was not really possible to see, and maybe Joanna can again share with us the one that says ideal 21st century healthcare education. And then if Brown could stress, people were really excited to see all the content, but it was difficult. Can you?
I'm trying, Eliana. I think that is this one, but I'm not very sure. Can you?
Yes, it's a kind of circles.
Oh, the circles. Okay. So this one?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, this one. Yes, this one.
And Eliana, what you want me to go through the different components? Yeah. Unfortunately, the slide itself, because of the colors that the design used, make it challenging to see. This was created by the consortium of schools that are involved with the American Medical Association's Innovations program. There are 33 schools, but the components, let me get my actual slide. Hang on just a second,
Yes.
and then I can tell you what they say. At the top, it says patient outcomes. The one at the very top is patient outcomes. Then if you go clockwise, the next one says, and I can send this to you, Eliana, with different colors, if that would be helpful, so that you could share it with everyone. Would that be good?
Yeah, yes, sure. I think it's important. I think it's important in this slide to stress what are in your view, what are the, let's say, the different perspectives that come up with this ideal 21st healthcare education. So what comes differently from the past? How do you interpret that?
The major differences are what I discussed, the engagement within the health care system, that the health sciences and health system science is probably the biggest difference. The focus on competency-based assessment, the focus on prevention and wellness for the student and the faculty, and then the use of technology, partly what Stan talked about, but also just the faculty member and the students already have the agility with the technology. It's getting those of us who are a different generation to have the same skills and with technology, and then the use of data, really taking advantage of all of the data that we collect and applying it. So I'd say those are the key differences for focus in the slide, but I can send it to you using different colors.
And when regarding to this 21st century professional, there is a question here that would be nice to complement your thought, because it asks about interprofessional education, and you had one of the boxes had the teamwork and team-based care. So can you make some comments on interprofessional education in health professions? Because I think it's a kind of movement that in Brazil is just starting. We can hear you. We can't.
I would characterize this that in the 1990s and early part of the 21st century in the US, there was a great deal of focus on the term interprofessional education. And the attempt was to train different health professionals together so that nurses and physicians and veterinarians, physical therapists, nurse practitioners would be trained together. And I think there is recognition that that is not only extremely challenging because of the way the different institutions are structured, but probably not as valuable as, again, putting the learner in the healthcare system where all of these professions exist. And so I mentioned that in my talk about the role of the physician in particular as no longer the leader of the healthcare team, but rather a member of that. And I think that is part of the shift in the focus of education, that the role of the physician is different in this interprofessional team, but no one has done a particularly good job that I'm aware of, at least in the US, of training students together for an interprofessional approach. It's more the recognition of the different roles and how they relate to function together as a team.
Great. I think it's really, really nice. So, Joanna, do you have another question for Brownie?
Yes, to Professor Brownie. For me, there's a slide that really synthesizes what we're trying to do here. And I have to make a special thank you for Professor Brownie, because I was part of a huge project, a large project that really shifted the way I thought about assessment. And we are trying to do this here. So you can see this is also a project of your teaching, and it was a privilege to me to learn from you. So the slide is that what says about the needs, the drive, outcomes, curriculum, and assessment. And we came from the healthcare needs, the major needs of the healthcare system. And as Professor Zeferino talked to us in the beginning of this symposium, we have a public health system that 70% of the Brazilian population use, and we have more than 200 million people. So we have a huge healthcare system, and based on that, we have to identify our competences and the way of assess them, and after that, we have to adapt the curriculum. So this is what we are doing. We identified our competences. We have an assessment committee here going toward a programmatic assessment. And now we're talking about the adaptations in our curriculum. So my question is that I'll be really glad if you told us about the multiple assessment tools and the portfolio, that the importance of assessment portfolio to a student, a medical student, so he can know all the paths that he has gone to. So you talked about it really briefly, and this is where we are trying to go. This is our ultimate goal here in our programmatic assessment. So we are trying to increase our assessment tools and to go towards an implementation of a huge portfolio of assessments. So it's really important to our community to hear it from you, and not only for me and Eliana. And of course, you have much more knowledge, and I think it's important to our community to be aware of the importance of the assessment in all courses. So in our course, of course, all medical and health courses, but especially in medical education is important. So if you can talk briefly about this, I think it will be very important for our community.
Well, I'm not sure what to say beyond what I've already said about the use of the portfolio to help the learner. Again, this is where it's very learner-centered, as well as allowing the faculty member to see the student progress. But the portfolio can be a huge motivation for the student to look at where gaps are, for the faculty member to look at where gaps are, to focus on formative rather than always summative assessment, to allow the learner to gather information. It's a fundamental source of data that can then be used both to inform your programmatic assessment as well as the individual student assessment. There are a number of schools in the United States that have developed portfolio systems, and I could put you in contact with a couple of those if that would be useful. One of them has so much data they're not sure what to do with all of it, but I could definitely connect you to at least 3 different schools that are using formative assessments as well as summative in the portfolio. So I will do that. I'll make a note to do that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Brown.
I think the important message here is about assessment for learning. Of course, you also need of learning, but you can make even the assessment of learning as assessment for learning. and we have to work on that, and on this concept. It's a problem everywhere, I think.
Just a small comment, just to highlight one thing that Professor Nocini also talked, is that we have like a conflict of interest in assessing our students. So the professor that is really close to the student in a clinical practice has sometimes some kind of bias to assess this student. So the importance to have like a centralized way of assess those students also, not just in the disciplines, but we have like an institutional centralized way of assessing. It's important to, of course, improve the assessment way of that we are doing, but also to take off this heavy problem in the shoulders of the professor that is day by day with the student in the clinical practice, that also develops a relation that is can be difficult to assess the quality, as Professor Nocini said, of the individual competence and abilities and everything. So I think this is also important, and it will be very, I think, very productive and important for our institution. Professor Eliana, I have a question for Professor Stanley. Whenever you have, and I don't want to.
1 minute. 1 minute. I have others.
To take advantage of all of them.
Let's use the chat where the people, I have the questions from the audience, and then if we have time, we continue. So Stan, of course, people are really surprised about your low-cost fidelity simulation models. They were really surprised and brought some good ideas on that. So first of all, how did you get to develop these ideas? It's a policy that the institution had and supported any studies on that, because one problem that we see in Brazil, and for sure in other places, is that the support of the institutions for research on education, it's not easily available. And as it showed, you certainly went through low-cost models, but you also use the high-cost models as well, at least to compare. So something about the structure to develop this research and these models and the institutional support. And there is another question for you related to the communication skills. How you organize at the Toronto University the communication skills training.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. So those are both really good questions. So, I mean, the first question I'll give you a two-part answer. Number one is, you don't have to do the research yourself. I mean, you can look at the literature. That's kind of why I presented this summary to you, so that you can feel confident that, you know, in choosing your simulation platform carefully, you're actually doing better than just simply shopping for a high-tech simulator. So just think carefully about what you're trying to teach, and then think about the design of the simulator when you're going to purchase it, or, you know, build something, or if you have those resources. So, you know, the research, what I'm saying is a lot of that research has been done. So you don't need to do that research yourself if you don't have those resources. Now, the second part of my answer is you should always do research if you can, you know, and if you have those resources. And I think you should just be collecting data on these things anyway, and just seeing what works. And, you know, I get that some people have no time to do that kind of thing, or no resources. So what I've developed is a very basic set of questions. When someone wants to come into the simulation center to teach medical students, I have them answer 4 questions, right? Number 1 is, you know, what are you trying to teach? Number 2 is, are you using this resource in the best way possible? And this was on one of my slides. How do you know it's effective? You know, is this your gut feeling, or have you seen this before, or you just feel like the design is a good one for what I'm trying to teach? And can you improve on the process? So I think if you ask those 4 questions, you know, you may have not thought about them. You may have very simple answers, but at least you're starting to think about how, you know, you're doing it in a critical and reflective way. And I think that's the step towards scholarship, right? So I think anything you do with engaging in purchasing simulation, you should be thinking about those 4 questions. And what I did when I was at Michigan and then University of Ottawa, where I had a leadership position, as a simulation director, I would go to the department chair and I would say, look, this person is a very good simulation instructor. Can you provide a bit of time and money, and I will help turn them into a researcher on these questions. You know, I'll help give them some support, not turn them into a researcher, but I will help them do some research and build their career, you know, so that they could get promoted, you know, in the future. And usually the chairman of the department would come back and say, I was wondering about that faculty and how I might support them in their promotion. So if you can have them do simulation as scholarship, that would be great. So I think that, you know, if your simulation center has some kind of support for not only running the programs, but also asking some questions and collecting data, then you can do this in a programmatic way. So that's kind of my answer to those two questions. The question about communication skills, you know, my focus, my focus was mostly on the surgical technical skills. So I personally didn't have a lot of experience with that. When I started working with the surgeons, I started working with the anesthesiologists too, of course, because they're all in the operating room together, and the nursing staff. And then we started looking at communication patterns. And I would say that the anesthesiologists have worked on this far more than just about anyone. You know, closed loop communication, interprofessional communication, being very clear about what is being said and what is being done, and showing people things. We had another project that was more recent than these ones that I showed you, which consisted of mounting a big display in the trauma bay, which was what we called our situational awareness display, so that everyone knew the next steps for this patient, or the patient's vital signs, or, you know, why we were doing these procedures with this patient in the emergency room. So that you can enhance communication in a number of different ways. I think, yeah, so I think there's lots of ways of doing it. I kind of agree with Brownie. It was interesting when she said about interprofessional education. I kind of agree. I don't think it's necessarily that effective to put students in one profession in the same room as students in another profession while they're learning, because they are going through a process of professional identity formation. So they need to be with their peers to become who they will be. And if you start to dilute that, it sort of confuses them a little bit, I think. But you know, putting them out in the clinical setting together, that's where it's helpful. And anyway, sorry, I don't have a more complete answer for that, but I think it's the anesthesiology literature. I could send you some stuff on that, communication stuff, if you're interested. And you're still muted, yes. Eliana.
Yeah, and your comment on interprofessional education, following Brownie, I think it's a very important one. People make a confusion about having people being trained together all the time, but as you said, you have to guarantee that they have their identity and they have other outcomes that they have to follow. And then, yes, in the workplace, they have to be together and they have to develop all the skills to be together in a very efficient way. So I think it was really nice, the comment and the suggestion from Brownie, and you were kind of supporting. One more comment is, you mentioned the promotion and the importance of having someone or having a group of people who will be kind of coaches for other professors who want to follow more the track of scholarship of teaching. And this is the discussion that we are now having in our school, because it took some years for people to understand the possibility of having this track and the university to accept that. But now we have it's our duty at the med school to provide support for the ones who want to go to this track. So thank you for mentioning, because I think it fits perfectly. One big discussion about faculty members, how you evaluate the faculty members themselves, and how teaching is evaluated in comparison to other more, how can I say, classic research activities. Joanna, I will give you the word for the question for STEM, and I may have another question for all of you.
Okay. Well, first of all, I have to join the group that is really jealous of all your your presentation that is showing us such an amazing group of simulators and with low cost. So as a surgeon, I was dreaming about doing that and teaching my residents. So you inspired us. Thank you so much. And all the comments are towards that inspiration that you gave us. So my question is about undergrad. So we have, and the balance between the role of simulation and teaching skills in a simulated environment and the clinical practice. We here are talking a lot about that because during the pandemics, we have, and all over the world, we have to go towards simulations environments because the clinical environment was really different when we have to adapt to you know, be in the front line of the pandemic. But I'm afraid of the simulation, the balance of the simulation and the clinical practice go towards the simulation, and I'm very sure that this will never ever substitute the clinical practice. So we're here talking about learning the skills before the clinical practice and the role that simulation have to make sure every student has the same experience. For instance, they have to attend a cardiac problem, and we have to make sure that all the students go through the same experience, and we cannot rely only on the clinical practice. So I'd like to hear you talk about this balance and when we have to stop with the simulation and when we assess that the student is ready for the clinical practice and the balance of that. I'd like to hear your thoughts about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great question. And with the pandemic, that's even become more acute. So I recognize that. I think it's interesting, right? I think you can set it up so you're teaching two things. You're teaching the skill, and then you're teaching the metacognitive skill. So where will this skill fit in the clinical setting? So you can communicate to the learner what the clinical scenario would be if they were to have this skill. So how would it fit in the team? How would they be able to use this skill in the clinical setting? Provide them not only with a simulation practicing the skill, but in essence, you're communicating this a simulation of the clinical environment. So you can provide some clues about what their life will be like when they're in the clinical setting. So you can even do this on paper, or you can do this by talking to them. You know, I'm sure as a surgeon, you can describe, you can show videos about what it's like to be in the operating room, you know, manage their expectations so that they understand their role when they get there, and that they have, if they have practiced not tying 100,000 times, then they can do that part, you know, when you ask them. But they're not going to be asked to close the wound, or they're not going to be asked to open or even to manage the case. But here's your role. So managing expectations and saying, this is a critical part. This is what works in the simulation center for training. This is not going to make you a surgeon. You know, this is not going to make you a competent practitioner in any specialty. But these are the essential skills that you will need to build on that. These are part of the building blocks. So I think communicating the importance of practicing particular discrete skills, and then give them a vision for where these skills will be used. I think that's a good combination.
Thank you, Stan.
Great, thank you.
Well, I have a question here from the audience, and I think it fits for everybody to give some clues. In Brazil, there is now a big trend on talking about how we can assess or evaluate the product of the program. I don't like the name, but what I mean is we call the egress, the person who left the program. In a way, it's how to evaluate people in practice, okay? So if you have to design some, and it's requested now from, not only from the graduate programs, but as well as the undergraduate programs, and it's a national request. So how do you see this going? Because it's not about having like health data of the population, but following students after they finish their programs. Do you have this experience? What would be your suggestions on this program that follow the people who finish their programs? Valid for the three of you.
I'll go ahead and start since I have to leave in just a couple of minutes. But John Norsini actually talked about this at the end. I didn't hear all of his talk, but in the U.S., schools have followed their graduates for a number of years. We have an instrument that is administered by an organization called the Association of American Medical Colleges that's called the Graduation Questionnaire, and it asks the students to complete a great deal of information about their experience in the educational program. And then there is a related part that goes to the residency program that the students enter. There's no requirement that the programs complete it, but it gives an idea of whether the graduates that they receive in their program are what they thought they would be, or do they have the skills that they were told this graduate had. And then John can talk about this better than anybody, but a lot of the American Board of Internal Medicine had patients complete forms about their experiences with their physicians that then went back, not necessarily to the school, but back to the residency program. So they've been done with surveys. And again, we could give you examples of those. But I would ask John to speak more about that.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, so I think that there are two models that Brownie has alluded to in the US that might be useful ones to look at. One, the oldest of the group, is probably Jefferson Medical College. And what Jefferson does is they have followed their graduates through residency program and into practice. A second model that has incorporated patient outcomes and patient data in that is been put together by NYU. That's another model that I think is particularly useful. Now, both of these organizations kind of run this through the so-called development office. And the development office is the office that follows students in order to get them to donate back to the medical school or the program afterwards. So there's a built-in financial incentive for them to follow them and collect that information as a kind of secondary piece. But the bottom line is that they're really incredibly useful data that they've gathered, both for evaluation of medical schools and residency training programs.
Nice. What about Canada, Stanley? Do you have any idea?
Well, I really can't speak to Canada, but I can speak to the ACGME and what we were doing in the United States.
Yeah.
And I know I'm thinking about Canada. I don't know, but you know, in the ACGME we have the milestones, and they measure the residents' you know, competency progression during training. What we're trying to do now, just recently, is kind of follow them out into practice and to see how well they're doing on these skills and whether their milestone ratings during residency predicts their performance metrics out in practice. So there's, you know, there's not only patient outcomes, but you can also measure process outcomes. So how are they behaving? How are they managing their practice? You know, what's happening with these graduates, and trying to relate it back to milestones. And we have some data, some information is coming through on that. So that's an attempt. The big challenge, and I think Brownie and John would agree on this, is kind of the attribution contribution problem. Like once they're out in practice, you kind of don't know what they've learned since they've been out in practice versus what caused their behavior during training. So you have to, the sooner you collect data right after practice, the more likely it's due to their training, but then they haven't really had a lot of experience. So there's kind of a sweet spot of 2 to 5 years where you're collecting data. It's probably most of it is due to their training experience, but then they could go and do quite different things after they're out in practice too. I think this is where it becomes interesting to think about core values versus competencies, right? And I think if you can look at how they were in terms of professionalism or knowledge of systems or practice-based learning and improvement or continuous quality improvement, if they have those health system science, if they have those kind of concepts embedded in who they are as a professional, then maybe that will express itself clearly after they graduate versus particular skills.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we can now finish. It's time to finish. And the way we finish, I think, brings us a very important concept. Again, because Stan just said that the values make a lot of difference, because medical doctors and in any health profession, you have to be a lifelong learner. So it's not the case that the med school has all the responsibility over your life, but then you have to put together all the experiences that people will have. And again, and the environment makes a difference as well. We know that the market where you are practicing also makes a lot of difference. So we have to take all this into consideration. I have to say, thank you very, very much. The audience was really very excited about what you said. It was perfectly fitted with our ideas and goals. And I have to tell you that we had about 300 people listening to our conversation here, people not only from Campinas, but from all over the country. And we have a very strong, as you know, community of medical educators that we can call for these very nice opportunities. And so thank you very much. And I hope to see you again in Campinas personally. And then we can go for something else than the screens. Thank you very much, all of you. See you after lunch. So we have now a break, our lunch, and we return with Nuno and also from Toronto with Rodrigo. Thank you.